thank you very much for support me in that work, GPS DNA origins.
Yeah, absolutely. The pleasure is entirely mine.
Professor, first of all, I would like to know if you explain how the GPS methodology work.
Absolutely. GPS Origins is based on a paper that we published in 2014. Was published in Nature Communications. That was the original tool. And what it did, it converts DNA information into geographical coordinates. Later that year, we were approached by this company, the DNA Diagnostic Center, and they asked us to develop a more advanced version of this tool called GPS Origins, which traces the origins of both parents. We saw the value in that, since all people have two parents and they may be from different origins, in which case the original tool will not cover. We saw the value in developing GPS Origins that breaks down the ancestry into global gene pools and use this information to say, to localize where the one's parents are from and trace their migration routes backwards to their countries of their ancestral origins. It can then take in account historical information from those places where the DNA predicted the parents to be and try to explain what motivated one's ancestors to move from place to place. So this is what the tool does.
Why the Phenoscandia gene pool is so high in our work?
Yeah, so this
happened.
The Phenoscandia is a gene pool that is very well localized in Iceland and Norway and a little bit in England, where the frequencies there are between 30 and 66%. The average that we've seen in your sample was 11%, which is the same as what we see in Portugal. So it's not extremely high. We have seen one person with 18%, I believe. So it's still within the acceptable range for this area in West Northern Europe, but it's not extremely high. Extremely high would be over 50%, which is what we see in Icelandic people and people from Scandinavia.
When Phenoscandia came to Brazil,
it is not that Scandinavians came to Brazil as much as the ancestors of the Scandinavians went to Scandinavia and elsewhere. They moved the same gene pools with them as they spread it around. And there are a lot of peoples who moved from place to place with their gene pools. For example, the Bell Beakers, they moved to Spain, but they also came from Germany and then they moved to England. So it's the same people, but they moved their genetic variation to different localities and making those regions more homogeneous for a short while. And then we start seeing different scenarios in Germany and different scenario in England, different mixtures, which once again creates new genetic variation that distinguish these two populations. And it's the same process that happened, that what we see today in Brazil. We see people of Western European origins moving to Brazil and moving their genetic variation with them, only to mix it again with the people they encountered once they met in Brazil. It's a huge melting pot, and that came up very strongly in your results.
If the size is a good sample size?
It is a good sample size for initial survey. Absolutely, we're making the first steps. We don't know what we're going to find. We don't know what questions we want to ask. We want to understand, get an idea of the scope of the genetic variation in Brazil, and to answer these questions. And we see that we got very good answers. We got very large genetic diversity, different origins, just what we would expect from the general population. We can say two things based on the results. Number one, that the sample size was good. And number two, that there was a good coverage of the population in Brazil. But to make more specific conclusions, make inferences about the recent past, the colonial period, the most ancient past, we need large sample sizes. And I hope this study would be just the first step in an ongoing effort to study this population.
Yes, DNA origins,
Yes.
this in Ceará state.
Yeah. So what we see in your results, we see a huge diversity. On average, Brazilians have more gene pools than any other single population in the world, which is a test to just how diverse and heterogeneous Brazilians are. And with some people showing up to 30 out of 40 gene pools. The only gene pools that are poorly represented in the sample that you provided are those in East Asia and Central North Asia, Eurasia, so Chinese, Russians, Mongolians, a bit of Southeast Asians. These gene pools are not represented in Brazilians. Other than those, you have everything else.
Okay.
And that's quite remarkable because it tells us a lot about the origin of the population, about the preservation of those gene pools. It's one thing to have starting with gene pools, but it's another thing to maintain them and protecting the people and making sure everybody can flourish and retain the signatures of their ancestral origins. So it's quite fascinating.
Some people reduces the Phenoscandia gene pool to Vikings. You think is just a stereotype?
I believe there is a trend of to exaggerate and picking on results that would make people read newspapers, and that's okay to a certain extent. That's how newspapers sell. We can talk about the court culture and the X culture, and a lot of other cultures that don't even have names, but then nobody would read the article. It is correct that the Phenoscandia gene pools is very localized to Iceland, but and regions in Scandinavia and England. And it is true that there is a Viking history in this region, but there is also history of other people who came after the Vikings. Today's modern-day populations are not replica of ancient populations, and a recent study showed that today's Icelandics are not replica of the ancient Vikings, which we know from the DNA sequence from ancient Vikings. There were a lot of mixtures with English and other populations that came up. So yes, I would agree there is a Viking contribution to these gene pools, but it's not the only one. So it is important to understand human history and when you read these kind of articles, and I hope that it would motivate people to continue and read history and explore and understand how different populations came to be and integrate or not, and ended up in our genome and left their genetic legacy in our genomes and our genes. I hope that's our shared goal with science and the journalists. The theory of races attests that human can be divided into biological racial groups that are distinct from one another and significantly distinct from one another. And this theory has been discredited since the works of Lowenstein in 1970, where he showed that human populations are actually very, very similar to one another, and the genetic distance between them, differences between the continental groups or racial groups, is about 10%. I later replicated this work with a much larger data sets, and I found 12%, so same magnitude. So there is no support to the fact that humans can be classified into racial groups. But if anything that comes out of this work is just how heterogeneous the Brazilian population is and how widespread their origins are over all the continents. So those results show the exact opposite of the predictions of racial theories. It shows that everybody are mixed and everybody have origins from different regions. That's the exact opposite of what racial theory says.
I have a lot of doubts about polemics ideas from outside.
Yes, it is important to have those questions asked and have those debates and continue and educate the public about genomes and genes and origins and history. And I'm delighted and honored that I got an opportunity to participate and consult in this effort. And I hope it would be just the first step, because I think there is a lot of work ahead of us. Even though these data are not designed for medical usage, it will have produced knowledge that will be useful for medical and other fields of studies, because at the end of the day, we all want to ask the same questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? And how can we make our study in cancer or autism or mental disorders more accurate by answering those questions? Because otherwise, it's a bit of a mix, which dilutes the results, and studies fail.
Thank you very much for helping me. I really appreciate talking to you.
The pleasure is entirely mine. Thank you.